Your lecturer is Dr. Stephen Novella. Dr. Novella is an academic neurologist at Yale School of Medicine and is a leading force in medical education for patients, the public, medical students, and medical professionals. He earned his MD from Georgetown University and completed his residency training at Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Novella is the founder and senior editor of Science-Based Medicine, a popular blog dedicated to promoting the highest standards of science in medical practice.
Do you believe that a technologically advanced alien civilization is visiting the Earth at this time or any time in the past? Are they abducting people from their bedrooms, perhaps even right out of a heavily populated area like a large city? Are they leaving us messages in geometric designs in wheat fields? If this is true, does the government know about it? And if so, are they engaged in a multi-generational cover-up of their knowledge of aliens? And if so, why? Is human culture, perhaps even the human race, descended from alien visitors? How can we claim to know the answer to these questions, or in fact, any question? In this course, we will explore our current knowledge of the human brain as a tool for thinking. The course is essentially a giant exercise in so-called metacognition, or thinking about thinking itself. It endeavors to give you the skills of what we call critical thinking. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. The motto for this course could be, the unexamined thought is not worth thinking. What's at stake with all of this? Well, science and belief permeate our lives. They permeate our culture, our civilization. We, for example, face environmental issues. Is there global warming? Is the planet warming up, for example? And if so, are we causing it, and what can we do about it? What future technologies should we invest our very limited resources into? If we make the correct choices about where to invest, then there's a lot to gain. If we make the wrong choices, we could squander billions on dead ends. Also, we buy products every day that involve claims, either explicit or implicit, and we need to be able to evaluate those claims in order to make good purchasing decisions. For example, there is a company that will sell you a very expensive piece of exercise equipment, and they claim that in 4 minutes of exercise, just a few times a week, you can get all the exercise you need to be in perfect health. That's as good as a 30-minute exercise using a lesser piece of equipment. Is this true? Is it worth spending thousands of dollars on such a piece of equipment? And how should we evaluate their claims? Should we listen to anecdotal stories by other people who may be using the piece of equipment? Or should we require objective scientific evidence to evaluate those claims? We also use critical thinking in order to think about how we run our civilization. Our population is rapidly approaching 7 billion people, and we need to make that sustainable in some way. I'm a physician. I see patients every day, and I know the difficulty they go through often in making healthcare choices for themselves and for their family. We have to purchase healthcare products, decide what foods to eat, what lifestyles changes to make in order to stay healthy. All of these claims are based upon evidence and logic, and we need critical thinking in order to be able to evaluate them properly. One of the premises of this course is that we are our brains. We are that 3 pounds of gray jelly that floats inside of our skull. The brain is comprised of about 100 billion neurons, plus a lot of other cells that not only support those neurons, but modulate their function. The brain is, in essence, an organ that can think. It is an organ that is self-aware. Not only the most complicated organ that we know about, it may in fact be the most complicated thing in the universe that we know about. The brain can remember, it can feel, believe, calculate, extrapolate, infer, and deduce. It does everything that we think of as thinking. It is our universal tool and our greatest strength, Most people believe that if there's one thing that separates us or that is our greatest advantage over all the other creatures on this planet, it's our intelligence. But the brain is also strangely deceptive. It is also the root of many of our flaws and weaknesses. This course will also be exploring what we might call human nature. This may sound pessimistic, but it's true that humans possess logic, but we are not inherently logical creatures. We are not like the Vulcans of Star Trek mythology, right? We have emotions. So in addition to being logical, we are also highly emotional creatures. What that means is that we tend to follow our evolved emotions and rationalizations. Our thoughts follow what you might consider to be the pathway of least resistance, not necessarily always the optimal pathway. Logic and critical thinking are therefore learned skills. While we have some inherent sense of logic, we are overwhelmingly emotional creatures. We have the capacity for logic, but logic and critical thinking are skills. We're not born as master critical thinkers. For example, we're also not born with the ability to play the violin like a concert violinist, or we are not born with the skills and the experience necessary to perform well as a football player in the NFL. You should no more expect to be born a highly developed critical thinker than you should expect someone to be born a violinist or somebody who can play in the NFL. These are all skills and abilities that need to be developed over years and practiced in order to be good at critical thinking. Humans tend to make a lot of errors in thinking. Our inherent tendency, again, this evolved pathways of least resistance, include a lot of flaws in thinking. Flaws in logic are one example. We call these logical fallacies. We tend to make logical connections that are not valid, that are not real. Our thinking is also plagued with many false assumptions. Our heads are filled with facts, things that we know to be true, but in fact are false. Either they're just out and out wrong, or they're just assumptions that may or may not be true, but we really don't know. Our memories are also massively flawed. We tend to naively assume that our memories are an accurate passive recorder of what has happened, when in fact our memories are plagued with numerous flaws that make them highly unreliable. And there are things that psychologists call heuristics, which are down and dirty rules of thumb or patterns of thinking. They're mental shortcuts that we tend to take that may be right much of the time, but they're wrong often enough that they lead us astray quite frequently. How do we compensate for all of these flaws in our brain's functioning? Again, that's what this course is all about, that metacognition. If I had to give a single term to encapsulate all of the skills in this course, it would be scientific skepticism. Skepticism includes systematic doubt, essentially questioning everything that you think, questioning the process of your thinking, and questioning everything that you think you know. The Scottish philosopher David Hume summed this up a little bit when he said, "A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence." That's one component of critical thinking, basing your beliefs on actual evidence as opposed to wishful thinking, for example. The goal of all of this is to arrive at conclusions that are likely to be true, as opposed to conclusions that are unreliable, but also to have some kind of a sense of how reliable our conclusions are. And this involves the scientific method as well. This is scientific skepticism, not just doubt, but a positive set of methods for examining reality. Science essentially is a systematic way of comparing our ideas to external, objective data. Science, in short, the goal of science is to lead us to conclusions which are actually true, as opposed to conclusions that we simply wish are true. However, not all science is valid. There is good science and bad science, or not so good science. And some science is so flawed that we, in fact, call it pseudoscience. It's not even real science anymore. Science follows scientific methodology. It is not a set of beliefs, but it is a set of methods. And there are ways of defining that as well as distinguishing good science from bad science, something that we will explore a lot throughout this course. Here's one example. There are many people and companies that claim that they have developed or they are developing an engine that can burn water as fuel. Now, of course, the incentive for such a piece of technology is huge. Imagine if we can replace all of the fossil fuels that are both expensive and that are putting carbon dioxide and other pollutants into the air. Imagine if we could replace that with something as simple as water. Essentially, what the process that they keep reinventing over and over again is to electrolyze water, meaning separate water into its oxygen and hydrogen components, the resulting mixed gas you might call oxyhydrogen, and then burning that oxygen and the hydrogen back together again into water. So the byproduct of the process is water. They're burning the gas, the oxygen and hydrogen, and getting energy out of it. If this really were a legitimate method for running a car or running any engine, how is it that the scientists and engineers of the world had missed this for so long? That's the kind of question that a critical thinker would ask. If, in fact, it is true that such an engine can work, then perhaps the reason it has been quote-unquote missed for so long is that there is a conspiracy of oil companies to suppress this scientific knowledge. That's often the rationalization that those who claim to have such a piece of technology put forward. But is such a conspiracy plausible? Is it itself now just another claim that is just as fantastical as the claim that you can burn water? We can also examine the plausibility of the claim itself by asking a very simple question. Well, if this is a process for generating energy, where is this energy ultimately coming from? Even a very high school level of understanding in thermodynamics will tell you that you're putting more energy into separating the water into oxygen and hydrogen than you can possibly get out of it again by burning it back into water. The process loses energy. It is therefore not a source of energy. So the plausibility of such claims are beyond low. They border on the impossible, as much as we can say so in science. So it's not very plausible. It's hard to dismiss that plausibility simply with conspiracy theories. And what evidence do they have that they can actually produce these engines that can run on water? Well, it's always very thin. It's always one step away. They just need a little bit more money from investors in order to go that final step to make it finally work. Their demonstrations always have major flaws, like they're running the engine along with a gasoline engine that's burning gas for fuel to electrolyze the water. They never give you what they claim. So that certainly is a cause for questioning the validity of those claims. This course will also explore the nature of knowledge itself. What can it mean to know something? What does that actually mean? Well, the scientific method is based upon what we call methodological naturalism. That's the philosophical term for it, which simply means that natural effects have natural causes. And in trying to model and understand the world, you cannot invoke essentially magic. You can't refer to supernatural or miraculous causes that don't have any testable cause in the natural world. It's not because we don't want there to be supernatural causes, it's just that they're not amenable to the methods of scientific inquiry. Therefore, from a scientific point of view, we could never really know about them. And we'll get into this in more detail in a future lecture on the philosophy of science. It also means that all conclusions in science are provisional. There is no such thing as 100% metaphysical certitude. There's no truth with a capital T. All of our beliefs have error bars around them. And as I said previously, not only do we have to assess what is likely to be true, but how certain or how confident can we be about that belief, knowing that we'll never quite ever get to 100% certitude. This also means that all of our beliefs are open to revision, that when new data comes in, or maybe just a better way of interpreting data or looking at the way things work, we have to be open to revising what we thought we knew. In addition to all of the flaws in thinking that I mentioned, human beings are also subject to delusions. Sometimes our thinking goes so far awry that we can invent beliefs, invent our own reality, or we can get swept up in the beliefs of others. One common manifestation of this is a public panic. Recently, psychics predicted that an earthquake was going to occur in Italy. This caused many people to actually flee from cities. The panic was so great. There were similar predictions made in New Zealand. These were based upon the false claim that the moon, the phases of the moon and the position of the moon controls or can provoke and therefore predict earthquakes. And again, without there being any basis in scientific fact, this caused a panic in the populace. Now, of course, there are earthquakes all the time. There is the normal background frequency of earthquakes. So there's always an earthquake of some severity just around the corner, especially in those parts of the world that are susceptible to earthquakes. And that can always be taken as confirmation about the prediction, whether or not the prediction had any new information in it at all. I also think it's helpful to consider thinking as a process and to focus on the process rather than on any particular conclusion. In fact, we should really invest in this process. Once we invest in a conclusion, I mean emotionally invest in a conclusion, then we start to twist facts and logic in order to fit that desired conclusion. And humans are very good at doing just that, rationalizing or twisting facts and logic to shoehorn them into a conclusion that we've already settled on. The character Sherlock Holmes, perhaps the most iconic rational character in literature, said in one story, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." And that captures the essence of what I am saying. Invest in the process and be very flexible when it comes to any conclusions. In addition, one might say that we are currently living not only in the age of information with the internet, we're living in the age of misinformation. We are subject all the time. Every day I get spam in my email which are making very specific claims, whether they're politically motivated, ideologically motivated, or trying to sell me something, or perhaps even lure me into a scam. There are many rumors that now spread not only like wildfire, but faster. They spread with the speed of electrons through the internet. There are many urban myths that capture our imagination in some way and again get spread credulously, so-called friend of a friend stories, like the executive who checks into a hotel, gets picked up in the bar, and then wakes up the next morning with his kidney missing while he's laying in a tub of ice. How plausible is that story? Should we believe it? Can something like that actually happen? But we are now awash in such stories, whether they're innocent and just fun versus malicious and trying to either steal our money or lure us into a scam, or maybe just to influence our voting. In a democracy, we are constantly subject to people who are trying to influence our political thinking. We also live in a capitalistic society, which means that every day we're subject to marketing claims. Marketing claims are highly motivated, in fact, to misrepresent the facts or to at least give us a very specific perspective. They're trying to influence our thoughts and our behavior. So they engage in what you might call persuasive speech and maybe even deception. Even when there are laws against outright fraud, marketers are paid a lot of money in order to flirt with that line. How much can they twist or misrepresent the facts without crossing over that line into actual fraud? And as consumers, every day, we have to sort through all of these deliberately deceptive claims to figure out which ones are reliable and which ones aren't. Further, many companies will use pseudoscience or even anti-scientific claims in order to back up their marketing, back up their products. And that can seem very persuasive to somebody who isn't schooled or skilled in telling real science from pseudoscience. Let me give you one example of this. In the last couple of years, a company has made literally millions of dollars selling so-called power bands. These are little pieces of rubber, in fact about $1 or $2 worth of rubber with a cheap plastic hologram embedded in it. Now, the company claims that this hologram gives off a vibrational energy, which is balanced in order to resonate with the inherent vibrational energies of your own body. And in so doing, it will improve your balance and your performance. You'll have more energy. If you engage in sports, you will perform that sport even better. In fact, they have many professional endorsements, recognizable sports professionals who wear their product and say that it helps them shoot baskets better or play golf better. So should we believe these claims? Should we spend $30 to $40 or maybe $60 in some cases in order to buy a piece of rubber we wear around our wrist and improve our ability to play golf? Well, the company further supports their claims with anecdotes, as I said, like not only professional endorsements, but just everyday people who use their products. And we tend to be very compelled by stories. When someone else is telling us a story, we are hardwired, if you will. It is human nature to find those stories very compelling. And they also give demonstrations. They have you hold on to a power band and show how much improved your balance is. It turns out that these demonstrations are very deceptive. They're little more than parlor tricks that a magician, for example, might use in order to deceive you. The American Council on Exercise actually did a blinded study of these bands, these rubber bands, as if they really needed to do, given the plausibility. But they went ahead and did it anyway, and they find when you blind people to whether or not they are wearing one of these bands, there is essentially no effect whatsoever, which means that any perceived effect was all in the minds of the people who were wearing the bands, who believed that there was some effect. This is not an isolated incident. There are many similar products. You can now buy a golf shirt that's woven with energy fibers that is essentially claimed to do the same thing as these power bands. But there's literally no science to support any of this. This is a great example of marketing pseudoscience, using words like energy and vibrations in order to convince people that there is something to it, when in fact, if you have a fair degree of scientific literacy, you could see this for what it is: meaningless pseudo-scientific jargon. So thinking critically is, as I said, a process. So what is this process like? What do we mean when we say to think critically? Well, there's a few components of it that are worth pointing out. The first is to examine all of your premises, all of the facts that you are assuming or that you think are true. Many of them may not be reliable, or they may be assumptions. You may not know whether or not they're true, but they're just something that you're assuming is true. You also need to examine your logic. Is the logic you're using legitimate, or is it flawed in some way, or perhaps it's just systematically biased in a certain direction? You also should try to become aware of your motivations. People are extremely good at rationalizing beliefs when they are motivated to, because they have a desire to believe a certain conclusion. Understanding your own motivations will help you deconstruct that process and will give you the skills to, again, lead to conclusions that are more likely to be true as opposed to the ones that you just wish to be true. And critical thinking also means thinking through the implications of a belief. That different beliefs about the world should all be compatible with each other. But we do have a tendency to compartmentalize, to just have one belief walled off from all other beliefs, and therefore we insulate it from refutation. But if you think, if this were true, what else has to be true, and does that make sense? And just continue that process, and that's a good way to tell how plausible and how likely to be true a certain belief or claim is. It's also a good idea to check with others, because no matter how developed your critical thinking skills are, you're still one person whose thinking is going to be quirky and individual. You have a limited fund of knowledge and a limited perspective. In fact, your knowledge and perspective may be limited in ways that you're not aware. You don't know what you don't know. So if you check your beliefs with others, it increases the probability that any of these holes in your thinking will be covered up. When a large consensus on a specific claim is achieved, there's probably a greater chance that that consensus reflects reality than the process of just an individual. There's no guarantee of that. A consensus may be systematically biased as well, but at least you're stepping out of yourself and the own limitations of your knowledge. It's also important to be humble, which means knowing your own limits. We tend to get into trouble when we assume we have expertise or knowledge that we don't have, or we don't question the real limits of our knowledge. The world's a very complicated place. Nobody could know everything. So we always have to be on the lookout for where the limits of our own knowledge are. And also, be comfortable with uncertainty. There are some things we simply cannot know, or we just currently do not know. And there may be times when, after reviewing all the logic and all the evidence, our only conclusion is we currently just don't know. The level of uncertainty is fairly great. Let's give an example from popular culture, which I will frequently do throughout this course. There are those who claim that there is a large hominid primate living in North America. You may call it Bigfoot or use the Indian term Sasquatch. Is this a credible belief or not? How can we know whether or not Bigfoot is wandering through the forests of North America? Well, what are the implications? If there is one such creature, either he's the very last of his kind, or if it's a sustainable population, there must be a breeding population around somewhere, which means there's hundreds and probably thousands of these creatures around. Where are they all? What's the evidence for such a creature existing? Has anyone ever captured a live specimen, found a dead specimen, found a skeletal remains? Any completely objective evidence that is not susceptible to misinterpretation. The evidence that is usually presented is none of those things. No actual unambiguous specimens of Bigfoot. All we have are what we sometimes call blobsquatch, fuzzy photographs through trees at the very limits of resolution and perhaps not well in focus pictures. So anything that we can't clearly identify, that becomes quote-unquote evidence for Bigfoot. Or there are things that are easily hoaxed, like just imprints of feet or footprints in the mud or in the ground. But there's nothing that we would consider smoking gun evidence. There are eyewitness accounts. There are people who claim that they have seen Bigfoot. Well, then that leads to the question, how reliable are eyewitness accounts? And we will explore that further too, but I will just quickly say now that they're very unreliable for many reasons that we will explore. Well, if there is no smoking gun evidence, then why do people persist or some people in believing in Bigfoot? And that's where the errors in logic and the rationalizations kick in. Many people engage in what we would call special pleading. Perhaps Bigfoot can become invisible at will, and that's why we never can capture an unambiguous photograph of him or capture him. Well, is that really a valid way of excusing the absence of evidence? And mixed in with all of this, there are just out-and-out hoaxes, like the Patterson-Gimlin film. This is the iconic movie of what appears to be a Bigfoot walking through a campsite. And this is still presented by some believers as the best evidence to date of Bigfoot. However, the film is not incompatible with a simple hoax. There is nothing in that film that can distinguish it from simply a person wearing a costume. In 2008, to give a more clear-cut example, Matt Witten and Rick Dyer claimed that they found a Bigfoot corpse and that they had the frozen specimen in a freezer. They even went as far as to call a press conference and to try to elicit the help of scientists to test the DNA of their Bigfoot specimen. In the end, what they had was simply a stuffed Bigfoot costume, and they were exposed as deliberately concocting this hoax. Why did they do it? You know, people do weird things for weird reasons, but they clearly did it. So we always have to be on the lookout for hoaxes and deliberate deception, not just innocent or perhaps flawed critical thinking deception in these types of claims. Let's also go back to the UFO example I gave at the beginning of this lecture. Those are really interesting questions. Whether or not you think that they're very plausible that we could be being visited by aliens, what I find more interesting than even that question is, why do people believe that we're being visited by aliens? As human beings, we have the capacity for curiosity as well as reason, but we are plagued by a host of cognitive flaws and pitfalls that may lead us to even fantastical beliefs that don't really hold up to the cold, harsh light of scientific scrutiny. But the good news is that critical thinking can be learned. It is a skill that you can learn and that can be reinforced by habit. The scientific approach to critical thinking is empirical. It is a way of testing our beliefs systematically against the real world that is out there. Once we develop our critical thinking skills and really begin to examine our beliefs systematically, it can be extremely empowering. It's in fact a defense mechanism against all the machinations out there that are trying to deceive us, whether for ideological, political, or just marketing reasons. It's also very liberating. It liberates us from being weighed down by all of those false beliefs and perhaps mutually incompatible beliefs that we tend to hold because of our emotional makeup. So developing these critical thinking skills is both empowering, liberating, and a defense mechanism against the world that we currently live in. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the famous Sherlock Holmes series of stories. The character of Sherlock Holmes was hyper-rationalist. He clearly understood reasoning and critical thinking, and yet Arthur Conan Doyle himself was deeply into spiritualism. He firmly believed in the spiritual mediums of his day. In fact, this eventually led him into conflict with originally his dear friend, the famous magician Houdini. Houdini was a rationalist, and he made a career out of debunking the spiritualist mediums of his day because he knew that they were using the same escapist techniques that he would use on stage to entertain. Doyle and Houdini came to blows over this, and that ended their friendship. Doyle also was famously taken in by what we now know as the Cottingley fairies. Two girls, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, claimed that they were being visited by little winged fairies in their garden at Cottingley Village, and they provided photographs as proof of this visitation. In the end, it was easily demonstrated that their photographs were of them posing with paper cutouts that they literally cut out of books and then propped up on sticks. That was the evidence, that literally flimsy evidence that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, completely fell for. It's a great story, and it leads to the question of why. How is it possible that the author of Holmes could have fallen for a literal childish hoax? And that's what we're going to be exploring in this lecture. Our brains are belief machines. We are motivated to believe. We are born to believe, especially those things that we want to believe. And what we will be exploring in this lecture is what drives this human desire for belief and what drives the specific things that we tend to believe in. The hope is that by understanding what motivates us, understanding what makes us tick, as it were, that we will be able to transcend or at least mitigate the influence of those motivations. In fact, we might say that the default mode of human psychology, a term frequently used to mean the pathway of least resistance, default mode meaning the way we will tend to think unless we make a specific effort to act a different way. The default mode is to arrive at beliefs for largely emotional reasons, and then to employ our reason more to justify those beliefs than to modify or arrive at those beliefs in the first place. Therefore, in many ways, we are slaves to our own emotions. That is, if we let ourselves be. It is helpful to try to understand this interaction between beliefs and motivations and reason in the context of neuroanatomy, of understanding the way our brains are organized. In a very meaningful evolutionary sense, our brains are literally a lizard brain inside of a mammal brain, inside of a primate brain, inside of a human brain. The most recently evolved parts of our brain, the neocortex or the frontal lobes, hierarchically can modify and control the earlier evolved, more primitive parts of our brain, all the way down to just our brain stem, the most primitive functions of all, just like breathing and doing very basic things, maintaining balance while we walk. And then we have more sophisticated, more highly evolved emotions on top of that, and then eventually our more advanced reasoning hierarchically on top of that. Much of our cognition, however, takes place subconsciously in the more primitive parts of our brain. And that is where the emotions take place. Emotions essentially make quick decisions for us that are mostly adaptive. They include things like fear, lust, hunger, anxiety, disgust, happiness, and sadness. They are evolved adaptive strategies. The thinking is that emotions provide an evolutionary calculus. They provide us with a very direct behavioral motivation. It is easier and more reliable, for example, to simply make us feel disgust at certain kinds of things, at certain chemicals that give off a certain odor, for example, or the way certain things look. For example, if food looks as if it's rotting, that will make us feel disgust, rather than to have us calculate the risks of eating a certain food. Or, for example, if we are confronted with a danger like a predator, we don't have to calculate the risks of encountering that predator or fleeing. We simply experience the emotion of fear, and then we act upon that emotion. Psychologist Abraham Harold Maslow made an attempt, perhaps the first attempt, to classify the different emotional needs that people have, known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in addition to the very basic emotions that I described, we also have a set of higher psychological needs that we seek. We desire to be safe, to be loved, to have self-esteem, and to experience what Maslow called self-actualization. There is some reflection in our neuroanatomy. As I said, there is a hierarchy from our more evolved parts of our brain to the more primitive parts of our brain, which will enact the more basic needs. The lizard brain can experience hunger, but only our much more evolved neocortex can experience something as the need for self-actualization. It's probably true and the current psychological thinking is that Maslow's hierarchy is not a literal hierarchy where you have to meet one need before you can meet a need at a higher hierarchical level. But it does reflect, I think, a reasonable categorization of the different kinds of needs that people have. We do know that when we meet our psychological needs, our brain gives us a reward. It makes us feel good, another emotion. There is a basic punishment and reward system built into the hardwiring of our brain. When we do something that is likely to be disadvantageous evolutionarily, we feel bad about it. And when we do something that is advantageous, we feel good about it. We get a shot of dopamine to our reward centers, and we feel good about the behavior that we just engaged in. So what are these needs? What are the needs that motivate us so much? Well, one such need is the desire for control, or at least to have the illusion or the sense of control. We don't like to feel as if we are victims of a capricious universe or a capricious world, or we are helpless in the face of unseen forces, or even randomness. We like to think that we exert some control over ourselves, over the events that happen to us, and over our environment. One manifestation of this desire for control is belief in superstitions. We tend to develop beliefs that if we engage in a certain activity, it will protect us in some way, or it will enable us to perform better or to succeed. And people really develop these superstitious beliefs. For example, sports stars are famous for superstitious beliefs. They may decide that if they wear a certain shirt, for example, that they will play a better game. This is nothing short of magical thinking, but it gives us the illusion that we can exert some control over otherwise random events. There is a psychological study done by Whitstone et al. Where they showed further that feeling lack of control enhances our tendency towards pattern recognition, our tendency to see an illusion of control in random data, which I will discuss more in a future lecture. We also have a desire for simplicity. And this is easy to understand. The simpler things are, the more control we can have over them, and we certainly don't like feeling overwhelmed by our environment, by the tasks that we have before us, by the things that are happening in the world. So we tend to oversimplify the things that we are confronted with. We are motivated to oversimplify. We pigeonhole and we stereotype. It enables us to boil down a very complicated set of data to some simple rule. This can be helpful and adaptive when we understand that the rule is just a schematic. It's an oversimplified representation of a much more complicated reality. But when we actually start to accept our oversimplified versions of reality as if they are reality, that leads to things like bigotry, where we may lump an entire group of people in together and assume that they all share traits rather than understanding all of the diversity and complexity that does exist within even definable groups. Let me give you an analogy from my own profession, and that is as a physician, and that is in making a diagnosis. We may seek the simplest answer to a complex set of signs and symptoms or problems that patients are confronting us with, and that may motivate us to find one answer, to find a single diagnosis that explains everything. However, that's not always the case. It may be that there is a lot of noise in the symptoms that a patient is presenting us with. They may, in fact, have one new condition, but they will also present signs and symptoms that have to do with just what we might call the symptoms of life, the background noise of symptoms that we all experience. And many patients have more than one chronic illness at the same time. So while we seek a simple answer, we may be confronted with a much greater complexity. A good rule of thumb is that reality is always more complicated than you think or that you would like to think. We also have a desire for the universe to have meaning. We want the universe to make sense. We want our lives to have meaning. We want there to be a plan for us. It gives us a sense of purpose, and it gives us a filter, a way of making sense out of all of the complex things that happen in life. Some good, some bad, some we just can't make sense of. But if we think that there's this overarching meaning to our own existence, it does give us this very comforting sense of meaning. We want to believe that things happen for a reason, when the reality is probably closer to the fact that stuff just happens. Related to this is our desire to believe that big effects must have big causes. We don't like to think that there could be a massive consequence to a very innocuous or innocent cause. The JFK assassination is one example of this. Many people still believe to this day that the President JFK was assassinated by some vast conspiracy of a large organization or perhaps forces working within the government, that it couldn't have been done by one person acting alone, the so-called lone nut theory. That just doesn't emotionally sit right with them. How could this one crazed individual by himself do something which had such a massive effect on world events? There had to be an equally big cause, a conspiracy that was equal to the consequences of the President of the United States being assassinated. Yet another need that we have is the need for self-esteem, the need to not only feel good about ourselves, but to feel that the others in our community respect us. This has largely to do with the fact that we are intensely social animals. A lot of our emotions and our thinking are tied up with interfacing with other people in our environment. Not only do we need to get attention from other people and feel loved by other people, but we need to develop very social skills, highly developed social skills. And part of that is looking after our own sense of self-worth and how others in our community look at us. This is often referred to as having an ego. And again, a certain amount of ego is very adaptive, but it also powerfully motivates us to interpret the world in a way that is favorable to our own ego. Psychologists often refer to this as the fundamental attribution error, that we tend to look for external causes to explain our own behavior. And when we do so, we're very kind to ourselves. We're very good at rationalizing away our own behavior in order to protect our own self-esteem. We also do things to avoid social embarrassment or stigma. For example, we may avoid appearing inconsistent. We always want to make our own behavior and our own beliefs seem consistent to others. And when we do so, we also have a very strong resistance to admitting error. We don't like to admit that we're wrong or to admit that we have flaws, because that is a threat to our self-esteem and our ego. Let me give you an example, a very sad example, unfortunately, from medicine. There are clinics in China and in other parts of the world who are prematurely offering stem cell therapy for severe medical problems, often neurological problems. In one case, a mother sought this stem cell therapy for her 4-year-old daughter who had severe loss of vision. The daughter was examined by eye doctors, ophthalmologists, before the mother took her to the stem cell clinic, and she was told that this treatment's really not legitimate. These clinics are not science-based. They're probably just taking advantage of desperate patients. But she was motivated to seek any possibility of a treatment for her child, a perfectly reasonable desire. She had paid for the treatment. Her child underwent the stem cell therapy. When she returned to her eye doctors in the United States, they examined her daughter and found that her vision was completely unchanged. All of the objective evidence said that there was no benefit whatsoever to her child's vision. And yet, the mother convinced herself that her daughter was seeing better, that she had improved vision. She used whatever confirmation bias and biased perception that she could in order to convince herself that her decision was not a mistake, that she had not subjected her daughter to an unnecessary treatment, perhaps even dangerous treatment, and wasted a lot of resources going against the advice of her physicians. Her motivation to believe that her daughter was helped motivated her to believe that she could see even when the objective evidence was that she couldn't. Another example from fairly recently, in May of 2011, Harold Camping, a self-professed preacher and prophet, predicted that the rapture would come, that his followers would be saved, while those who were not a follower of his particular brand of Christian belief would be met with a literal hell on earth. On May 21st, this divine judgment did not come. Nothing happened. Initially, his followers were perplexed. They couldn't understand how the very careful predictions of Harold Camping, which he justified with some elaborate analysis of biblical phrases, they couldn't understand how it could not come true. But then they hit upon their rationalization. Harold Camping argued that the judgment, in fact, did occur, that it was just a spiritual judgment, not a physical judgment. Therefore, there is absolutely no outward manifestation that the judgment occurred, no evidence. Therefore, he and his followers were enabled to maintain their belief in the face of pretty dramatic negative evidence. This is not an isolated incident. This is, in fact, what typically happens when prophecies fail. When prophecies fail, the believers, in fact, are strengthened in their belief in the prophet and in the prophecy. They find some way to rationalize away the failure, and they dig their heels in, and they are motivated to believe even more strongly. This, again, partly stems from the need to appear consistent, which is related to the need for social esteem. We try to avoid appearing as if we conflict with ourselves. In fact, salesmen may exploit this human need to appear consistent in order to persuade you to buy something that perhaps you don't really need. They might say something, for example, would you say that this would be a useful product to buy? Or could you find a use for this product? If you agree with that, then you appear to be supporting the value of it. And if you then say, yes, that would be valuable, but I still don't want to buy it, that would make you feel inconsistent, and therefore you try to avoid that. They also do something which is called getting the buyer down to the final objection. They, in essence, get you to say that you would buy their product if it were not for this one thing, this one problem that stands in your way. They then eliminate that last objection. Therefore, you have no further reason to defend your decision not to buy the product. If you now still refuse to buy it, you will appear inconsistent, and people will buy the product rather than risk appearing inconsistent to the salesperson. A lot of how these motivations affect our thoughts and behavior can be explained with a concept known as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance theory has been a very successful theory throughout the last decades of psychological thought and research. It's turned out to be a very helpful, robust model. Essentially what this means is that when we have two beliefs in our head at the same time that are mutually exclusive or that conflict with each other, that causes the emotional experience of cognitive dissonance. We don't like that feeling. It motivates us to resolve the conflict. Now, initially, we may avoid cognitive dissonance through compartmentalization. We just keep conflicting beliefs separate from each other. But when they are forced into conflict, we need to resolve that conflict somehow. An adaptive way to resolve the conflict is to update one or both beliefs. If they are in conflict, one or both must be in error in some way. And if we find and correct the error, that can resolve the dissonance. But what we tend to do is to simply rationalize away the belief that we want to hold. Our belief conflicts with reality because there's a conspiracy, because, well, it happened, but it just in a way that's not evident. We engage in what a logical process we call special pleading, where we invent reasons to resolve the apparent conflict between different beliefs. Humans are, in fact, very good at inventing reasons to justify our beliefs. Let's also look at morality. One of our emotions, if you will, is a sense of justice. That is something that is hardwired into our brains. It's not a learned sense. We have an innate sense of justice. In fact, animals in the animal kingdom have also been shown experimentally to have an innate sense of justice. For example, there is a species of bird that defend each other from predators. When one bird sees a predator enter an area, they will give off an alarm, and then they will come to the defense of their territory. And by flocking together and defending their territory together, the many smaller birds can fend off a larger predator. If, however, one of the birds in the community, in the area, does not come to the defensive call of other birds, when they give a defensive call, those birds will not reciprocate. They will not defend that bird. These birds seem to have an innate sense of reciprocity, of justice, if you will. Let's discuss a classic moral dilemma to see how we have an innate hardwiring in terms of how we think about morality and justice. Let's say that there is a train switch. This is the so-called train switch example that can divert a train from one track to another. On one track, there is one person, and that's the track that the train is currently heading down. On the adjacent track, there are 5 people. Now, most people would say, well, one person versus 5 people, you would much rather have just one person die than 5 people die. However, let's say the train is going towards the 5 people. Would you flip the switch to divert the train so that it kills only one person than 5 people? You still will be responsible in a way for that one person's death, but you will save 5 people. Most people will do that. They will save the 5. They will switch the tracks, actively killing that one person in order to save 5 people. If you alter the context a little bit and you say, okay, different scenario, there's 5 people on the track. Again, the contrived situation of this moral dilemma is they don't see the train coming. There's no way to get them off the track. You're on the front of the train standing next to another person. If you throw that person off the train onto the tracks in front of the train, that will trigger the brakes of the train will brake and save those 5 people. Will you throw that person onto the track in order to save those 5 people? Most people won't do that. They will switch the tracks from 5 people to one person, but they won't throw somebody onto the tracks in order to save 5 people. Now, the cold calculus is the same. You're sacrificing one person in both cases in order to save 5 people. But something feels different to us about that situation. Throwing the person on the tracks is just too much of an active, direct cause of their death, and we're emotionally unwilling to do that, when the more passive approach of just switching the tracks, which will cause, downstream the train to hit that one person, we were able to overcome that by not throwing the person on the tracks. There's no real rational reason for that. That is simply derives from our evolved emotional sense of what's right and what's wrong. Here's another example. This comes from the book Supersense by a colleague of mine, Bruce Hood, who is a psychologist. He has an example that he often uses on lectures where he says, would you wear a cardigan sweater that was once worn by a famous serial killer? He, in fact, will offer people $20 to just wear a sweater that the sweater's been dry cleaned, it's 100% perfectly clean, there is no blood or anything else on the sweater. It's just a sweater that happened to have been worn by a famous serial killer. Many people will not wear the sweater. Perhaps you could think for yourself, would you feel comfortable putting on this sweater? Why is this? It's just wool or cotton or whatever it's made of. It can't possibly harm us. But we have a sense of disgust, our emotion of disgust gets triggered by this. And this is tied to another sense that is inherent in humans, and that is the sense of essence. The notion that inanimate objects can carry the essence of their history. There's something different about that cardigan sweater because at one point in its past it was worn by a serial killer. It's spiritually contaminated in some way. Again, when we explore this belief, it doesn't really make sense, but it just doesn't feel right to us. In fact, most cultures have a concept of spirituality. This innate sense of essence goes beyond just inanimate objects, and we think that there is a spiritual force, whether it's called animus, chi, or prana. This life force separates us from things that are non-living. In fact, we tend to categorize in our brains living from non-living things. We process information about living things differently than non-living things. Specifically, living things are processed through the emotional centers of our brain. We imbue meaning and feeling to things that we think are alive in ways that we don't do neurologically to things like a rock that are inanimate. Although the division is not exactly between living and non-living things, it's between things that we think of as having agency and things that we think of as not having agency. By agency, we mean it acts as if it has a will of its own. It acts as if it is acting on its own. So if a branch is blowing in the breeze, we rationally know that that is an inanimate object. It's not. The tree's alive, but it's acting just passively in the wind. But if it's moving and it's making noise, we may instinctively think, oh, maybe that may be a predator, maybe something that is acting on its own will, something with agency. This, for example, is why we so easily imbue meaning and emotions onto, for example, cartoon characters. We can be emotionally moved by a two-dimensional cartoon character because it's acting as if it is a person, as if it has agency, and that triggers all of the emotional hardwiring in our brains. We also have a sense of the supernatural, the belief that there is more to the world than what is immediately apparent. This ties back further to our need for a sense of connection, a need for there to be meaning, a need for the profound. When we have a sense that we are connected to something that is profound, it feels good to us in some way. This can then be reinforced by confirmation bias, by sifting through data and looking for the data that seems to confirm our beliefs, which we'll talk about more in a future lecture on biases. This all affects our behavior, the way, obviously, our motivations and our emotions. And in fact, we have looked for ways, psychologists, to influence people's behavior. There are many very practical reasons why we might want to do this. Public service campaigns, for example. We want people to not drive drunk, for example. So how do we do that? Our initial instinct is to give people information, assuming that they will arrive through reason at the correct decision and the correct behavior. But research has shown that this is not very effective. It's very difficult to change people's behavior just by making a rational argument to them. Their behavior is still overwhelmed by their beliefs. It's overwhelmed by their emotions. The scared straight so-called approach is very minimally effective. However, if you address the individual's emotions, that is much more effective. It's still difficult to get people to change old habits, but if you convince them that, for example, by using social pressures, and this utilizes a technique called social norming, if you tell people, other people don't drink and drive, that will have more of an impact on your behavior than telling you the reasons why you shouldn't drink and drive. I like to use children as an example. If you're a parent, or if you have nieces or nephews, or in some way spend time around young children, it's obvious that they are very socially inept. Their brains have not fully developed, specifically their frontal lobes, the most evolved, hierarchically highest part of the brain that it gives us our ability to socialize. specifically to plan our activity and to think about how our behavior will be perceived by others and by the public. Children have not fully developed that part of their brain. So they have a lot of the same basic motivations and emotions that adults do, but they don't have this social filter that we have in place, and therefore their motives are much more transparent. So they're an excellent window into human emotions and motivations because they're not good at hiding them. Adults are better at hiding our emotions, at our motivations. We're better at rationalizing what we want to believe, and we're better at putting a socially acceptable spin on our behavior. Again, the underlying psychological motivations, however, are largely the same. We do legitimately mature as we get older, but our same basic needs are all still there. Ironically, highly intelligent people may not necessarily be better at making decisions, but they are better at rationalizing the decisions that they do make. Psychologists now recognize a separate skill set called emotional intelligence. Being a rational, logical, and intelligent person isn't enough if you don't also combine that with the skill set of emotional intelligence. This is understanding the relationship between our motivations and our decisions, the tendency to relieve cognitive dissonance with rationalization. And when we understand these things and understand the emotional basis of our motivations, then we can transcend what I like to call our monkey brains and act on a more transcendent, a more critical thinking level of decision making and behavior. Essentially, neuroanatomically what we're doing is we are using our frontal lobes to make good decisions rather than just rationalize bad decisions or rationalize the primitive decisions that our emotions want us to make. Getting back to Arthur Conan Doyle, again, a fascinating, now almost iconic story of a person who was able to understand rationality well enough to craft the character of Sherlock Holmes, who was certainly a rational, critical thinking character. And yet he chose superstition and fantasy over reason and science. Perhaps if he understood his own motivations better, had developed his own emotional intelligence better, he would have been a little bit more like his own character of Sherlock Holmes, and he wouldn't have fallen for the Cottingley Fairy or the spiritualist mediums of his day who were using essentially simple parlor tricks to fool the public. We all live with this illusion that we are rational beings. We like to believe that we are rational. Again, that's part of our self-esteem. The truth, however, is far more complicated than that. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the famous Sherlock Holmes series of stories. The character of Sherlock Holmes was hyper-rationalist. He clearly understood reasoning and critical thinking, and yet Arthur Conan Doyle himself was deeply into spiritualism. He firmly believed in the spiritual mediums of his day. In fact, this eventually led him into conflict with originally his dear friend, the famous magician Houdini. Houdini was a rationalist, and he made a career out of debunking the spiritualist mediums of his day because he knew that they were using the same escapist techniques that he would use on stage to entertain. Doyle and Houdini came to blows over this, and that ended their friendship. Doyle also was famously taken in by what we now know as the Cottingley Fairies. Two girls. In this lecture, we're continuing to explore the ways in which our underlying brain activity is deceptive and constructed. We're moving on now to perception. For example, in July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800 crashed shortly after takeoff. There were many eyewitnesses who reported seeing a missile or a streak of light going to the plane. However, an exhaustive FBI and National Transportation and Safety Board investigation concluded that there was no missile. Therefore, what did all those eyewitnesses see? Another very dramatic example, in 1978, a red panda escaped from the Rotterdam Zoo. The story of the escaped panda ran in the local papers, following which there were hundreds of red panda sightings all over the city. However, it was soon discovered that the panda was killed just outside the zoo, and that the bear had died prior to the story and all of the sightings. Therefore, what did all of those hundreds of eyewitnesses see? It could not have been a red panda. Is seeing believing, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that believing is seeing? In this lecture, it's my job to convince you that you cannot trust anything you think you see or perceive. There are simply too many flaws in the ways our brain constructs these perceptions. Our perceptions are not passive. It's not like a tape recorder or a film camera where details are simply recorded as they come in. In fact, our brains actively construct a picture of what is going on around us based upon a tiny fraction of all the sensory information that's coming in. This introduces many opportunities for distortions and error. Magicians have learned over centuries, really, how to exploit the foibles of the brain's sensory processing. They have developed a practical knowledge of how to deceive you, how to do things right in front of your face without you seeing or perceiving that they happened. They use this knowledge for entertainment. However, it certainly is possible for these same tricks to be used for nefarious purposes. Art is another example in which artists, in this case, have learned how to exploit the ways in which our brain processes information in order to create a specific effect. For example, they have developed laws of perspective and dimensionality, the ability to create a three-dimensional image on a two-dimensional canvas. They do this without an underlying knowledge of the neuroscience, but just a practical knowledge of how the visual system works and how it constructs what we think we see. Perhaps the simplest demonstration of the constructed aspect of our sensory input is optical illusions. Illusions, all types of illusions by definition, are times when the brain constructs a sensory perception in an incorrect way. It's a misperception of reality. Generally, objects in our world appear to be stable and they appear to be accurate with respect to reality. That property psychologists refer to as constancy. And optical illusions, by definition, represent an exception to constancy, a time when objects are either not stable or they do not accord with reality. There is some kind of internal inconsistency or paradox in what we think we are seeing. This is because the brain has to make assumptions. It makes assumptions about what's likely to be true, and then it processes the sensory information based upon those assumptions. Most of the time, those assumptions are correct, but when they're not correct, that results in an optical illusion. Now, constructed optical illusions are designed to specifically exploit known ways in which the brain processes information. There are different types of optical illusions. There are perspective illusions, which all exploit the ways in which our brains construct three-dimensional images out of two-dimensional input. Visual input is all two-dimensional. Our retinas are a flat, if curved, surface. And the brain has to then infer from that two-dimensional input a three-dimensional world with relative size and distance and movement, for example. Mostly it does this with the stereoscopic vision, the fact that it has input from two different eyes that it can compare. But even with just input from one eye, and you can test this yourself by closing off one eye, the brain can make reasonable inferences about the three-dimensionality of the world around it. There are optical illusions that are also based upon relative shade and size of objects. There are illusions based upon ambiguous stimuli, where the brain can construct the image in more than one way, and your brain will tend to switch back and forth between different constructions. And there are after-image optical illusions. The visual system will adapt to lighting and color, for example, and then when that is changed, the adaptation causes an after-image that's not really there. Some examples of optical illusions that are fairly dramatic, in my opinion, include a shading illusion. In this illusion, a shadow is falling across a checkerboard. Now, the light squares in the shadow appear to be lighter than the dark squares outside of the shadow, even though they are, in fact, the exact same shade. You can move the squares next to each other and see that the shade is identical. But your brain makes the lighter shadows, the lighter squares in the shadow, seem lighter relative to the darker squares, and the darker squares outside the shadow seem darker relative to the lighter squares. That's a brain processing thing that alters how you see the shade of those squares. You can't unsee this optical illusion even when you know exactly what is happening. The same thing is true of size. For example, the moon horizon illusion. The moon appears to be bigger when it's on the horizon than when it is overhead, but this is in fact not true. It is merely an illusion that is resulting from the fact that when the moon's on the horizon, there are objects, trees and buildings, etc., that give perspective. When the moon is high in the sky, there's nothing to compare it to, so it seems relatively smaller. Some other three-dimensional illusions. Again, the brain makes assumptions about size, distance, and relative position. These assumptions are based upon what is usually correct, but when one or more of those assumptions are incorrect, the brain can construct a false three-dimensional image of reality. The ability to judge distance is especially important. No one is immune to these factors, poor viewing conditions, to lack of a clear reference, for example. So even being a trained pilot or a trained observer does not make your brain construct things differently or make you immune to these illusions. Three-dimensional images are a construction. It is something that is happening inside your brain, and that's important to remember. There are also perceptual reversals. This has to do with ambiguous stimuli, your brain constructing images in different ways at different times. There is the classic cube illusion, for example, where you have a two-dimensional drawing of a three-dimensional cube, and either face can be perceived as pointing towards you at any one time, and in your brain the cube can flip back and forth between facing one direction or another. There is also a spinning silhouette illusion, a silhouette of a young female dancer spinning around, and your brain can perceive her as either spinning clockwise or counterclockwise, and it will tend to flip back and forth between one direction and the other. That's because the illusion, the spinning silhouette, is compatible with rotating in either direction. Your brain can construct the shadows and the perspective either way. Research looking at how people perceive the spinning silhouette illusion also reveal other influences, such as perspective biases. For example, we assume that our brains tend to assume that what we are viewing is receiving light from above. There is a lighting from above bias in how we construct images. And this does tend to make certain versions of the spinning silhouette illusion appear to be moving in one direction more often than the other. Another ambiguous stimuli illusion, this one is a very classic one, is the old-young woman illusion. In this, you have a picture that can be constructed either as an old woman looking in one direction or a young woman looking in the other direction. The ambiguous stimuli can be constructed in different ways. There is also the horse camouflage illusion. A picture of a snowy landscape with rocks could appear to be just that. However, the snowy and the rocky areas are laid out in such a way that it actually suggests the shape of a horse with brown spots on white fur. Your brain may or may not put that together into the shape. When it does, however, then the picture of the horses will snap into place, and then you cannot unsee those horses. This is also a process of your brain filling in missing information. The outline of the horse is just suggested by the drawing, and then your brain will fill in the details. The image again snaps into place. These types of optical illusions I've been talking about has relevance for UFO sightings, for example. Pilots or others believing they see an unidentified flying object. For example, in 1997, a military helicopter reported seeing what they thought was another aircraft that was about to collide with them. They, in fact, took evasive action. However, it turns out that what they were viewing was simply a mylar balloon. It was a small, metallic balloon. However, the pilot, again, a trained pilot, somebody with a lot of experience who you would think would be able to distinguish a balloon from an aircraft, was unable to do so. His brain made wrong assumptions about distance, and everything else flowed from there. Of course, your brain could see the object as being far away, large, and moving very rapidly, or it could be close, small, and moving very slowly. Your brain can construct it either way. The pilot's brain thought that he was seeing a large aircraft moving quickly towards him, when in fact it was a small balloon just drifting by. Another example, the Stephenville Light UFO of January 8th, 2008. Some witnesses saw a UFO 1 mile long. Investigation reveals, however, that these were simply flares that were dropped by F-16s. However, the witnesses constructed the UFO by connecting the dots. This is something that our brains do when it's constructing our perception of the world around us. It will fill in lines or connections where it thinks they should be based upon assumptions about what it thinks it's seeing. In this case, 3 disconnected dots were perceived of as being part of one massive mile-long object. Another example of how it's possible to think you're seeing something that's not there simply because of the situation is the Battle of LA. Now, I'm not referring to the 2011 movie, but rather the air raid over Los Angeles that took place on February 25th, 1942. Over 1,400 anti-aircraft shells were fired. Eventually, however, it was concluded that the entire air raid was simply a false alarm, probably the result of war nerves. This was towards the beginning of World War II. And it might have been triggered by something as innocuous as a weather balloon. However, once the shells were started to fire, the soldiers who were manning these anti-aircraft batteries were firing at something. They thought that they were seeing planes invading the west coast of the United States. Another dramatic example of how our brain constructs a picture in our heads from the sensory input is the fact that the different senses can actually influence each other. Our brains will compare different types of sensory input in order to construct one seamless picture out of all of them. And it will adjust one sense or the other in order to make things match. One example of this is a 2001 wine test by Moreau, Brochet, and Dubardeau. What they did was they colored white wine with red food coloring. They then gave the red wine to wine tasting experts and asked them to describe what they were tasting. The experts used objects to describe the odors and the taste that was the same color as the wine being tasted. In other words, they were describing the white wine as if it were a red wine. They were fooled, apparently, their very highly developed and sophisticated wine-tasting sense was fooled merely by the color of the wine they thought they were drinking. In a related study, Brochet placed the same exact wine into different bottles with then either cheap or expensive labels. Wine tasting experts were then asked to compare the different wines and rate them. They rated the wine with the expensive label in glowing terms, while denigrating the same exact wine with the cheap label as unworthy. Here we could see how perception was fairly dramatically influenced by mere expectation, even among experts. Gender perception is something else which is also a combination of different types of sensory input. You might think that it's purely visual. Does someone look male or do they look female? However, there are numerous studies which indicate that what we see in terms of gender is affected by the voice that we hear, especially when the visual input is ambiguous or androgynous. We will see an ambiguous or androgynous picture as male if it is accompanied by a male-sounding voice, and as female if it's accompanied by a female-sounding voice. This same research also shows that we respond better to congruous sensory input when the voice matches the face we see it coming from and the movements that are being made, rather than incongruous. Sometimes our brain will have difficulty putting conflicting sensory input together. Another, again, very dramatic example of how our brain uses different types of sensory input in order to construct its picture is the so-called McGurk effect, after the researcher who first described it. The consonants that we hear are affected by the mouth movements that we see. For example, if you hear someone say ba, and while looking at video of someone saying ba or fa or da or va, we will actually hear what we see people saying. What we hear will be dramatically influenced by the mouth movements that we are actually seeing. Our brain adjusts the sound in order to make it congruous with the lip movements that we see. You actually hear different consonants when this is happening. Again, a very dramatic example of how our brains are modifying, altering, constructing the sensory input. There is also temporal synchronization. Sounds and sights, like clapping hands, seem to be simultaneous. However, the light traveling from somebody clapping their hands travels much faster than the sound waves propagate. Therefore, the two sensory inputs do not arrive at your sensory organs, at exactly the same time. It also takes a slightly different amount of time for your brain to process those two types of information. And yet, when we look at somebody clapping their hands, the two events appear to be exactly simultaneous. That, however, is a constructed illusion in your brain. Your brain synchronizes the two events because it knows that they're supposed to occur at the same time. In fact, as long as the visual and auditory information are within 80 milliseconds of each other, your brain will perceive them as being simultaneous. So, therefore, if someone is clapping their hands while moving farther and farther away from you, and therefore the difference in time between the visual and auditory information is getting farther and farther apart, they will still seem to be synchronous, seem to be occurring at the exact same moment until they are arriving at greater than 80 milliseconds apart, which will occur when someone is about 90 feet or 27 meters away. At that point, they will suddenly become noticeably asynchronous. So it's not the kind of thing that happens gradually. Your brain keeps them synchronous until you're outside of that 80 millisecond window, and then it's suddenly noticeably asynchronous. It's also true that our brains actually see, or at least infer, a little bit into the future. When we catch a baseball, the 80 milliseconds it takes for your brain to process the visual information would make you miss the ball every time. You would be 80 milliseconds behind reality. It may not make a difference in everyday activity, but when you're trying to catch a fast-moving ball, those 80 milliseconds will make a difference. So our brains evolved in order to compensate for that. They actually project rapid movement slightly into the future in order to compensate for this 80 millisecond delay due to processing. Another example, this one is a so-called pathological example, meaning it doesn't occur in everybody, but it does occur in some people, and that is called synesthesia. Synesthesia is a phenomenon when one sensory modality is interpreted by the brain as if it were a different sensory modality. Therefore, people with synesthesia may see numbers or hear light or smell colors. A color will have a smell to them. This happens because one part of the brain is interpreting sensory input of a different sort. So if you have visual information going to your auditory cortex, the auditory cortex will interpret it in the way that it knows how, as a sound. You will be able to hear light. It's not clear whether this synesthesia represents a bleeding over of information from one sensory area to an adjacent sensory area in the brain, or if there are actually specific connections being made, if this is an alternate type of wiring in the brain. To some extent, there is some synesthesia, even in all so-called normal, neurologically typical individuals. Again, our brains do compare and do use the information. That visual information is influencing the auditory cortex, as in the McGurk effect. So there is some cross-processing going on. With synesthesia, it's just much more dramatic. So up to this point, I've been talking about the ways in which our brain constructs the sensory information that's coming into us, makes assumptions, alters it, highlights certain things, for example, in order for the information to be useful to us, but at the same time introducing artifacts and error. Now I'm going to shift a little bit to the ways in which we pay attention to that sensory information. Attention is hugely important to the notion of perception because we are being bombarded with an overwhelming amount of sensory information. You cannot possibly pay attention to even a significant fraction, let alone all of it, at the same time. So we filter out most sensory information that is reaching us, and we pay attention to only a very tiny amount of it, what our brains deem to be important. Again, that's something that magicians have learned to exploit. They know how to make your brain attend to one area or to one thing that's happening and completely ignore and not perceive at all something else that's happening, even though it's right in front of you. There are some now famous experiments in which this is demonstrated very dramatically. Subjects are asked to watch a video, for example, in which they are instructed to focus or pay attention to one type of activity that's happening in the video, while at the same time something else very dramatic is happening in the video right before your eyes. And about 60% or so of people who watch the video will completely miss it. They will be completely unaware of dramatic events happening right before their eyes, simply because they were instructed to attend to a different part of what was happening in the video. In fact, our focus, the amount of focus that we have, can also shift around. We can be focused on just one part of our visual field, with completely ignoring the peripheral vision, or we can be on the lookout trying to diffuse our attention among a greater percentage of our visual field. In fact, only the very center of the visual field is highly detailed. If you hold out your thumb at arm's length, the size of the thumb is about the area where you have 20/20 vision if your vision is normal and healthy. Everywhere else, you have extremely poor vision. And you generally can't pay attention to every part of your peripheral visual field at the same time. We do tend to shift around to, say, the upper left or the lower left part of our peripheral vision at different times. When you do that, when you attend to one part of the visual field, the objects in that part of the visual field are actually enhanced. Your brain will process more of the information coming from that part of the visual field, and it will suppress information coming from other parts of the visual field. And that is an important concept as well. It's not just that we're paying attention to only one part of our sensory information. When we do that, we actually suppress information coming from elsewhere in order for our brains to prevent getting distracted by all sorts of what it deems to be, at the moment, irrelevant information. So what I described is what we call inattentional or attentional blindness. We are blind to things that we are not attending to. There is another very closely related phenomenon called change blindness. With change blindness, we do not notice sometimes even dramatic changes that happen in our environment. For example, if you're looking at a picture with a lot of elements in it, and the picture flashes on and off, so you're not looking at it continuously, very dramatic changes can happen to that picture, to that scene, in the flashes, that it will be very difficult for you to perceive. You will not notice most of them. You will be blind to the change. Researchers have explored the extent to which we can be blind to even significant changes. For example, now there are several experiments showing that when interacting with an unfamiliar person, somebody you don't know personally, that person can actually change outside of your view. And about 60% of the time, subjects won't notice that they're talking to a different person than they were just a moment ago. Even a dramatic change such as that, changing one person for an entirely different person, can escape our notice. An example of our ability to only attend to a small number of things at the same time is multitasking. The term multitasking itself is sort of a recent invention used to define doing more than one thing at the same time. The research shows, however, that people essentially can't do this. We cannot attend to more than one thing at the same time. What people do when they are multitasking is they shift their attention back and forth between or among the things that they are doing or that they are attending to. But they only have so much attention. They can only give attention to just one thing at a time. In experiments, only about 2.5% of people, for example, were able to talk and drive at the same time without a reduction in their driving performance. That's a very small number. The rest of the people had a significant decrease in their driving performance while they were attempting to attend to something else at the same time. In other experiments, it's ironically been demonstrated that people who think that they are good at multitasking actually suffered from multitasking the most. Their performance went down the greatest when they attempted to multitask. Therefore, dividing our attention uses up cognitive resources. It is exactly as if you, say, have 100% of your attention. If you divide it between two things, then each is getting 50% of your attention and performance goes down by 50%. In addition, it may be a little bit worse than that because you're expending a little bit of your resources to switch back and forth, and therefore both tasks suffer even more than if you were just focusing on one at a time. Talking on your cell phone while driving is now a very important example of this, and that's why many states now have laws that prohibit doing that, because your ability to attend to what's happening around you significantly decreases when you're just having a conversation. Eyewitness testimony is therefore notoriously unreliable if everything I've said in this lecture up to this point is true. Eyewitnesses are subject to suggestion. They have a false confidence in their own accuracy, and they're subject to confabulation, making up details. Remember, I said that our brains construct a narrative, a story. They construct a consistent reality out of what it thinks it perceives. And part of that construction is to fill in missing pieces. That's called confabulation. And people will do that subconsciously, automatically, and they will think that these pieces that they added were perceived, were actually out there in reality. Therefore, perception is a construct. That's the bottom line lesson of this lecture. It is something that is happening inside your brain. Each individual sensory stream is interpreted and modified. The different streams are combined and compared and then altered based upon that comparison. And we attend to a very small subset of that information, which we then weave into a whole story, adding in confabulating pieces as needed. The end result is a story that is largely a fiction. The brain creates illusions of a continuous congruent reality, fills in the gaps as needed, makes assumptions that are usually but not always true, resulting in illusions that are dramatic when they're specifically designed to trick the brain. But this happens to us every day. Every day that as we're going through our lives, we don't get this objective, perfect view of reality around us. We have this very, very imperfect, constructed view. There are also higher order constructions. In a subsequent lecture, I will talk about how sensory input is constructed into meaningful patterns. So not only are the components of what we perceive constructed, how we put it together into a meaningful way is also constructed. This will often result in unnecessary arguments from what I call an irrational faith in the fidelity of our own perceptions. If, however, we understand the limits of our perceptions, then we will not overly rely upon them. We will not say, hey, I saw it with my own eyes. Seeing is believing. We'll say, I think I saw this, but honestly, I don't know, and I can't really know exactly what I saw because it was something that was constructed by my brain. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about memory, because as soon as you perceive something, it becomes a memory. So what you really have are memories, which themselves are constructed and altered, of what you think you saw. In lecture 4, I will go over in more detail how our memories are also constructed. Imagine a witness who recalls an extraordinary event. They're very confident, sincere. They're a reliable witness. Their recall is vivid and detailed. This may be an event of a crime, a UFO, an unidentified object in the sky, a ghost or a Bigfoot sighting, or some other rare or weird event. How reliable is the testimony of such a witness? Also, think of your most cherished childhood memory. Chances are the memory is almost entirely a fiction. I know most people don't want to think that their memories can be so unreliable or flawed, but that's my task during this lecture, is to convince you of how utterly flawed human memory is. Like perceptions, memory is not a passive recording. We don't have tape recorders in our head. Our memories are constructed. They are constructed entirely by our brains. They are, in fact, part of our internal narrative. They're tied together with everything that we think and everything that we believe, with our internal model of reality. There are various different types of memory. For example, there's short-term memory, a several-minute window of memory. The anatomical structure in our brain where that occurs is called the hippocampus. There is also working memory. Working memory is our ability to hold a few bits of information in our minds and manipulate it in some way. So when you're adding a couple of numbers together, you're using your working memory to hold on to those numbers and do the calculation. There is also long-term memory. Long-term memory, as the name implies, are stored more diffusely throughout the brain for a long period of time. This lecture will focus almost entirely from this point forward on long-term memory. But actually, before I begin to tell you how terrible our memory is, it is worth pointing out that human memory can be incredibly powerful. There is a classic experiment which was recently replicated by a colleague of mine, Richard Wiseman, who is a psychologist, in which they take two subjects and expose them over a few days to 10,000 different photographs. They then showed them photographs and asked them whether that was one of the 10,000 photographs they had recently witnessed or not. And the subjects, on average, were able to correctly identify 68% of the 10,000 photographs that they were recently exposed to. So in terms of raw capacity, and in terms of just being familiar with objects that we have seen, especially visual memory, human memory can be quite powerful. Although, again, there are lots of ways in which it has limits. The limits of human memory are not just with recall. We tend to have an innate sense that our only problem with memory is recall. That's because we feel like we have difficulty remembering something, but then it may pop into our mind that we suddenly have access to that memory. That leads to this false assumption that all problems with memory are recall problems, but that's not the only problem at all. Some memories never form. We may experience something but never consolidate it from short-term into long-term memory. Memories also degrade over time. There is actual loss of information. It's not just difficult to access the memory is actually not there anymore. But even worse than just pure recall, our memories can fuse together. Two different memories can be fused into one memory, or they morph. The memories change over time. They alter in details and in generalities over time. But let's talk about recall first. There is one type of long-term memory that is called a flashbulb memory. This is a memory that we have for an unexpected emotional event, as opposed to the everyday mundane events of our lives, what you had for breakfast. Flashbulb memories tend to be vivid, they tend to be very long-lasting memories, and they are reinforced by the emotion of the event. In fact, a strong emotional experience does strongly reinforce a memory. We tend to remember emotional things more than events that do not carry with them emotions. And specifically traumatic events are generally lead to very strong long-term memories. There is a 1992 study by Nesser and Harsh where they questioned 106 students right after the Challenger explosion. So what they experienced when they heard that the Challenger, the space shuttle that exploded as it was launching, when they heard that represents a flashbulb memory, a sudden, unexpected, and emotionally laden event. They then re-questioned 44 of the 106 students 2.5 years later. Those are the ones that were available for follow-up. And they scored those students on the accuracy of their memory of where they were and what they were doing during the Challenger explosion 2.5 years earlier. That's not that much time. 2.5 years is a fairly recent long-term memory. 25%, 1/4 of those students scored 0 out of 7 in terms of details, accuracy for details of that flashbulb memory. Half scored 2 or less. Recall in general in the entire group was very bad. And it wasn't an all or nothing problem. It's not as if the students either remembered everything that they were doing or had no memory for the event. Most had some memory, but their memory for the details was simply appalling. This type of experiment was replicated with the 9/11 2001 terrorist attacks. Tallarico and Rubin did a similar flashbulb memory recall study. They found that the accuracy and consistency of everyday and flashbulb memories degraded equally over time. So they took the prior study one step further. They not only assessed the accuracy of a dramatic flashbulb memory, the 9/11 events, but they also had the subjects recall everyday events, like what they had done a couple of days before, and then they compared the ability to recall the two types of memory, everyday versus flashbulb. They degraded it at the same rate over time. However, subjects with everyday memories, their confidence also decreased at about the same rate as their accuracy did. But for the flashbulb memories, their confidence remained high, and the memories remained vivid and emotional. So the memories differed in those two respects. Now, interestingly, the confidence in the memory was not a good predictor of the accuracy of the memory. We tend to naively assume that if we're very confident in a memory, if it feels vivid to us, if we can recall it easily, it must therefore be accurate. But the research does not bear that out. They were uncertain if the results from similar or distinct processes. In other words, what causes us, how do we assess our own confidence in our memories versus how do we form those memories in the first place? So it's still not certain if that's the same process or if there's a distinct neurological process somewhere else in the brain where we assess our confidence in our memories. Memories of details tend to increase confidence. But having a vivid memory for detail, it does not necessarily predict accuracy. So again, this can result in the overall result of all this is a vivid memory that you feel very confidently about, but which is extremely inaccurate, perhaps even 0 out of 7 in terms of its accuracy. Overall familiarity did not increase confidence that much, but better correlated with accuracy in some experiments. So the overall familiarity with the memory may predict accuracy a little bit. Vivid recall of details, not so much. The bottom line of all of this is that confidence itself is not a good predictor of accuracy. In relation to the disconnect between accuracy and confidence, there is also something with which memory psychologists call source amnesia. How often do you say, or do you hear someone else say, "I read somewhere" or "I heard somewhere," and then they relay some fact or some story? We have a particularly bad memory for the source of information, even when we can recall the information itself. So it's interesting to think that our brains simply do not dedicate a lot of resources, a lot of memory resources, in order to note what the source of information is. Perhaps it wasn't that big a deal in terms of our everyday survival in what we would call the evolutionary milieu, living in tribes on the African plains, for example. But now in our much more complicated civilization where we're dealing with multiple sources of information and we have to assess the sources, the reliability of a source of information in order to say something meaningful about that information itself, this source amnesia is a major problem. Knowing that you heard something somewhere just is not that helpful if you have no way of assessing how reliable the source was because you don't remember the source. Similar to source amnesia is truth amnesia. We remember a claim much more easily than we remember the distinct fact of whether or not that claim is a myth. There is now the famous Skumic et al. Study of 2005, which showed that as many as 27% of young adults misremembered a false statement as being true only 3 days after they were told. And 40% of older adults misremembered a false statement as true. They remembered that they had heard the statement before, but they didn't remember that it was false. They didn't remember the truth aspect of that claim. So truth status appears to fade faster than familiarity, as does source status. Familiarity leads, therefore, to a truth bias. which gets reinforced with repetition. This is even worse. The effect of not remembering the truth status of a claim is worsened when the truth status is not revealed until the end. This has a lot of implications for myth-busting, for information campaigns. So, for example, if we say that this specific claim is a myth, it's a myth that there is a causal link between vaccines and autism. What people remember is that I remember something about vaccines and autism. I don't remember what the details were. They don't remember that it's a myth. They don't remember where they heard it from. They just have this familiarity with this association between vaccines and autism. Recently, it was in the news that there was concerns about apple juice and arsenic. It turns out when you investigate the details that there's no concern, that the levels are well below safety limits. But now it's out there in the public. Yeah, there's something about apple juice and arsenic. They may not remember where they heard it from. They may not remember the details that the FDA said the levels are well below safety limits and that it's really a non-issue. But they just remember that there's something out there. Psychologists also distinguish thematic versus detail memory. These are also different types of memory that we have for an event. By thematic, we mean the gist of the overall event, its overall emotional content. Again, to use an example from our evolutionary history, if you go to a certain location and there's a predator there of some sort, all you may remember is, when I was in that location, there was something dangerous there that made me afraid. I don't want to go back to that location unless I absolutely have to. You may not remember all the details of exactly what kind of predator, exactly what happened. The gist of the memory is enough for you to act upon it in a survival way, in a meaningful way. In fact, there are different brain patterns for each of these types of memory. We can look at functional MRI scanning, which is a way of imaging real-time brain activity, and we can have people remember the themes of a memory of an event versus focusing on remembering specific details, and different parts of their brain will light up during those different types of memory tasks. So remembering details is neurologically, it's anatomically different than remembering the theme of a memory. We also tend to focus on stimuli and ignore peripheral details. For example, a witness will tend to remember the weapon that an alleged assailant was holding. They tend to focus on an emotionally laden detail. They remember that he was holding a gun. And they remember, again, the emotional gist of the event, that there was an assailant, he was holding this weapon, and he was threatening. But then when the police asked them to remember details, what color was his eyes, what was he wearing, what was the color of his clothes, those kind of details, they may not remember those details at all. So here there's this trade-off between remembering the emotional gist of an event and remembering the details, and unfortunately, we're simply not very good at remembering details. But the situation's even much worse than that. It's much worse than just the fact that we don't have a good memory for details. We're very good at familiarity. We're good at thematic gist. We're bad at details. But worse than that, we actually alter the details. This gets back to the notion I described earlier that memories are not passive, they're constructed. When you remember a memory, you're not just experiencing this stored memory. You're actually reconstructing the memory as you recall it. You're updating the memory. You're bringing it up to date with everything that you learned since the last time you remembered or thought of that memory. We construct a narrative, a story in our heads about what happened to us in the past, what is happening in the world. And that narrative has emotions and themes to it, and we actually alter the details in order to be in line with our narrative, the thematic narrative. If we think that we remember an event where an assailant was being threatening, we may remember them as being larger than they were, being more threatening than they were. We may even remember them doing things that they didn't do, but that are all in line with the emotional theme of the memory. So details are not only inaccurate, they're biased thematically. We invent details and we change details in order to make a story more emotionally punchy. Here is an excellent example that is fairly well documented. Jane Hill was a famous witness to the JFK assassination. She was standing very close to the vehicle when the shots were fired. We have recorded her report on the day of what she saw, as well as photographic and other video evidence for corroboration. Yet her story slowly morphed over the years to fit the narrative theme that she had developed of a conspiracy, that there was more than one shooter there. Initially, her reports were very simple. She said that she saw nothing. She was standing next to the car when the shots ran out. She saw what happened to the president, but otherwise she didn't really see a thing, is what she said. But then over the years, she started to embellish her story. She began to add details that maybe she saw something over at the grassy knoll. And then years later, she saw a person over at the grassy knoll. Eventually, she even recalled running down a person, running after a person who was trying to flee the scene from the grassy knoll. These details were all added bit by bit over years each time she was interviewed. She remembered the gist of the event, and she remembered the narrative that was developed, that there was a conspiracy of multiple shooters, and then the details morphed over the years, documented on multiple interviews, to fit that narrative, completely disconnected from the reality of what she actually saw as documented immediately after the event. Past events become, in this way, contaminated, and researchers talk about memory contamination. We incorporate details that we are exposed to after an event into the memory of the event itself. Researcher Loftus et al. Studied thousands of subjects and found that people incorporate misleading details from questions or other accounts into their own visual memory. So, for example, you show subjects a film of something happening, and then just by asking them leading questions, what was the woman in the video wearing? When in fact, let's say there was no woman in the video, but you're asking them about a woman, so they think, all right, there must have been a woman there. Why else would you be asking them about a woman? Therefore, they remember seeing a woman, and they invent details. They can tell you what she was wearing. They can see the details. They remember them vividly. These are false memories that were constructed easily just by asking a slightly leading question. There is also a need to conform to what we think we know about the event we're trying to recall. Witnesses therefore tend to contaminate each other's accounts, bringing them in line with each other. Now, all of this is not deliberate deception going on. These witnesses are all honest and sincere. This is just how our memory works. In order to keep all of our memories consistent, we update the details so that they all fit together. And if we have to alter or make up details of a memory in order to do that, our brains happily do that to fill in any gaps, gloss over any inconsistencies. So at the end, we have a consistent narrative, even though it may be completely inaccurate. UFO witnesses, therefore, if you have 3 or 4 people who all witnessed the same unexpected, unusual event, light in the sky, as it were, they may all give a very consistent account, and that consistent account may be interpreted as evidence that they experienced something real. However, if they talked with each other about what they saw, they have contaminated each other's memory, and now they will have incorporated the details that the other persons suggested to them into their own memory. And they may have vivid, detailed memories of seeing things that were simply the result of the communication they had among them. We can even make up details entirely. We tend to invent details to fill in the gaps. in order to create a consistent story and reinforce the emotional themes. This gets back to the fact that memory is a construction. It's not a passive recording. We are constructing memories. And our brains have to do this in many trivial ways. For example, when we blink, we miss a little bit of visual information, and our brains stitch together the visual information so we have one continuous stream. Well, we do that cognitively as well. We stitch together the different bits of things that we perceive about an event and that we remember about an event, and we stitch it together in a thematic narrative, and we fill in all the gaps. This is called confabulation. We make up details as needed in order for the narrative to be seamless. There are lots of experiments into the human tendency for confabulation. For example, there's one famous study in which there is a staged theft. You go to a public area where there are a couple of confederates. Confederates are subjects that are participating in a psychological study. They're carrying out the scenario. And a person simply says, hey, somebody stole my radio. And then police officers who are also Confederates come in and they take eyewitness testimony. People who were there will describe the radio. They will describe a suspicious person who probably took it, when in fact there never was a radio. No one ever came in and took it. The entire scenario was made up. But the witnesses were told there was a radio. They were told it was stolen. They're being asked to recall what happened, so they invent all the details they need to in order to make the narrative make sense. There is also what's called forced confabulation, where leading questions are asked, say, about a film that was viewed. A week later, subjects can remember seeing a non-existent scene that was never in the film that they were asked about. So again, we make up these details to fill in our internal narrative, and they become indistinguishable from quote-unquote real memories. A memory of something we made up or confabulated feels like a memory of something we really experienced. We don't have a way of telling the difference. This is sometimes referred to as the Rashomon effect. This is based upon a 1950 Kurosawa film about a rape and murder where the same story was told from 4 different accounts, and it was a very artistic depiction of how different accounts can be. Everyone has their own perspective, their own filter, and their own memory. And therefore, when they compare notes later, there may be striking differences in how they each constructed the same event that they were all experiencing at the same time. You probably have experienced this yourself many times. Imagine a time when you had a very heated argument or discussion with other people. Over a course of 30 minutes or an hour or so, you may have been heatedly discussing something. And then afterwards, when things have calmed down and you're comparing notes about who said what, you may find that you and the others have very different accounts about what just happened previously. You might even say, oh, I wish we had a camera rolling when this conversation was happening, because what you're claiming now is completely not what happened. But you have to recognize that your memories are as biased, constructed, and flawed as everyone else's in the room, and that's why none of them fit together. You all had different perspectives and different filters. The ability to confabulate can lead to what we call false memories. In 1988, Ellen Bass and Laura Davis wrote a book called The Courage to Heal. In this book, they promoted the idea that there is an epidemic of what they call the repressed memory syndrome. They believe that many people, mostly women, were abused as children, often sexually abused, and even the victims of bizarre, ritualistic, satanic torture. They felt that the memories of these highly traumatic events were repressed, and that they manifested themselves later on in life as adults as anxiety, depression, and eating disorders or other problems. What they created, however, Bass and Davis, was an epidemic of what is now known as false memory syndrome. Therapists who followed their prescription, in fact, encouraged clients to remember details of abuse. They said the first thing you have to do is recognize that your eating disorder or whatever is a manifestation of a childhood abuse. They started with that premise. And they said, I want you to imagine yourself being abused, what was happening, imagine the details, who was doing it. They essentially came up with a very good prescription for manufacturing false memories. And this led to many, many thousands of people manufacturing these memories of intense abuse as children and believing that they were real. They, again, having these confabulated memories. In fact, there were cases of people who were sentenced to prison for committing abuses when the only evidence against them was from so-called recovered memory or false memory. Bud Hopkins is another example of how easy it is to innocently or naively manufacture false memories. Hopkins is a painter who became an amateur UFO abduction investigator. And his research technique was to use hypnosis to interview subjects who suspected that they may have been abducted by aliens. Usually what happened is somebody would read a book or watch a TV show about alien abductions and say, I wonder if I was abducted. I had some unusual experience, or I saw a UFO once. And some of these people may have found themselves in the hands of somebody like Bud Hopkins, who used hypnosis in order to recover what he believed was their partially repressed or erased memory of their alien abduction. Under hypnosis, which essentially is a condition in which people are highly suggestible, even more so than normal, he would ask a series of very leading questions where he would encourage them to imagine themselves being abducted. It's therefore not surprising that a standard abduction scenario would emerge out of those hypnosis sessions, and then his clients would come to really remember being abducted by aliens. But there's every reason to think that these were just another form of false memory. It's so easy to create false memories, in fact, that you could do so just by giving people a simple word list and having them memorize the list. You can give them very subtle suggestions by just having a theme to the words on the list. And then you show them another list that has words that were not on it, but they are similar to words that were on the list, or they're in the same theme. So if you, for example, give subjects a list of 10 different kinds of fruit, and then you show them another list later on, all of fruit, but with different kinds of fruit on the list, they may remember seeing the types of fruit that they hadn't seen. They constructed a false memory of seeing those words because thematically it fits with the theme of the words that they were given. Children are particularly susceptible to suggestibility and creating false memory. There's also often social demands and other motivational factors that may cause us to bring our memories in line with what's being suggested to us. There are false experiences as well that are very easy to generate. Now, a study was able to produce a false memory of subjects eating popcorn just by exposing them to vivid imagery of others doing the same thing. So, for example, if they read an advertisement for a new brand, a false brand of popcorn that describes it vividly as how it tastes and how it feels, and then a week later they were asked whether they were actually given the popcorn to taste or whether it was just described to them, a certain percentage of the people who were never exposed to the popcorn will remember having eaten it themselves. They incorporated the vivid description and they inserted themselves into the events that they read about. We do have, that is a tendency that psychologists have now described, and this is an example of it, the tendency to insert ourselves into memories that we recall. Now, this is a caution for any profession that must elicit a history. So police officers, physicians, therapists, any time where you're soliciting a history from another person, you need to remember the incredible tendency for suggestibility and creating false memories. This is why, like for example, as a physician, I always teach medical students that when you begin to take a medical history, you should never ask leading questions. You need to ask open-ended questions and let patients fill in the details themselves. If you ask leading questions like, are you having a pain in your left shoulder, you're going to generate a certain amount of suggestible false positives from that. Further, not only do we need to avoid encouraging people to invent memories, we need to make sure there's always some external physical corroboration. Courts, in fact, are moving in this direction. More and more caution about the validity of eyewitness testimony and recognition of the need to validate any testimony with some kind of objective evidence. In conclusion, the way to summarize everything I've discussed is that memories are highly constructed. Every time you remember something, you are recreating the memory, updating it, and changing its details. Memories will change over time. They fade over time. We lose important details like whether or not they're correct. They can fuse one memory to another. We can take one detail from one memory and insert it into another. They morph to fit our internal narrative. And we cannot tell the true memories from entirely false memories or contaminated memories. Our confidence is not a good guide. The bottom line is that it's naive to implicitly trust our own memories. This may be unsettling, but it's an important step to recognize that we need to be realistic and humble about the limitations and flaws of human memory. It will help us avoid wrong conclusions and unnecessary conflict and arguments. How many times have you argued with somebody over your differing memories of an event? You just have to recognize that without external objective verification, you really can't know how accurate the details of your memory are. But by recognizing the fallibility of human memory, that is an important step on the journey towards true critical thinking.